Bob, give me a 1, 2, 3. Give me a 1, 2, 3. I got nothing.
Testing 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah.
Morning. If you are a visitor, we do have a registration table. Before you leave today, sign that so we'll know you were here, and you may be here tomorrow. I hope you're here tomorrow. And so if you sign today, you won't have to worry about signing tomorrow. The other thing, as far as tonight's concerned, we'll have our cookout tonight here at 6 o'clock. We're manning the parking lot, so we should have parking. Unfortunately, this is an annual festival every year, and it's a lot of motorcycles. But we're not going to worry about that. So there'll be a place to park this evening, and tonight we'll start at 6 o'clock with the cookout, and then around 7:15 or so, 7:30 or so, Brother Jack will have a message for us.
Good morning. We're glad that you're here. My wife says, well, you're dressing kind of casual this morning. I said, well, it is kind of casual. But this is a church shirt. You see that? So I didn't worry about it. But we got a casual speaker. Well, he's more than casual. 18 years ago when I moved here, one of the first preachers in the area that I met and wanted to meet was Bobby Dockery. Bobby Dockery is sort of a legend in Northwest Arkansas. You can be a legend in a number of ways, and I'm not sure which way it is that you are.
Not all of
a
them
legend,
good.
but
Yeah.
But he was the minister at the Baldwin Church for 43 years. He's had a long relationship, of course, with Northwest Arkansas and with the Center Street Church of Christ in particular. He's also often identified with the Gospel Tract Ministry, which I learned started with the Center Street Church about 45 years ago. And then for 43 years it's been, I think, or 40 years or more, it's been associated with the Baldwin Church and now independent with that. But if anybody knows anything about the Center Street history, and history in general of Northwest Arkansas, and it's always been a pleasure for me to visit with Bobby because I love history as well, and so we have a lot in common in that way, and he is just a walking history book about things, and the church in particular in this area. And so, of course, this being our 70-year celebration of our location, our being at this location, no one better to tell us about the church's history in this area, Northwest Arkansas, and particularly Center Street, than Bobby Dockery. And so we're glad to have him this morning. And before he speaks to us and shares some of these tidbits of information, let's go to God in prayer. Dear God in heaven and earth, we praise you today, Father. We give you the honor and the glory for the opportunity to be here. And we ask you to bless Bobby today as he shares with us our heritage in this location and in this area. We appreciate him and for the influence of good he's been here for several decades as he continues to influence the community with good news. Bless him today and bless us that we can be a blessing to others. In the name of Jesus we pray. Amen.
Amen.
You know, Bobby.
Thank you very much. It's an honor for me to be here. I do love history, enjoy research, and enjoy talking about it. Jack in his prayer used the word heritage, and that's really what we are talking about today. The heritage of this congregation, located now for 70 years on Center Street. Although, as we get into this, you may learn that actually the church has been connected with Center Street a little longer, maybe quite a bit longer than that. I really want to talk about the origins of the church, how it began, and then through its history, how it got here, and talk about some of the great works that the Center Street Church has accomplished for the sake of the Lord. The Restoration movement came into the Ozarks region as early as 1822. There's a record of a man by the name of William McMurtry, who was a carpenter and a preacher. He originally came from Virginia, but he organized a Christian church near Libertyville, Missouri. Never been there, but it is in St. Francis County. And then in mid-1834, Barton W. Stone, the restoration leader, received a letter from a man named Thomas Wood at Pettyjohn River in Crawford County. It was still Arkansas Territory at the time. In the letter, Brother Wood informed Brother Stone that he had moved to Crawford County with a few of my Christian brethren. And then he goes on to say that he had immersed 63 people in less than 2 months. Directly connected with New Testament Christianity here in Fayetteville is this man, Alfred W. Arrington. He was born in 1810 in North Carolina. At the age of 20, he became a Methodist minister in Indiana. At the age of 22, he arrives in Little Rock. He was a spellbinder. He was a handsome man, tall, 6'6", in an era when not many people were that tall. And he created a sensation among the local Methodists in Little Rock. In 1834, he's 24 years old now, he turns up in Fayetteville, where he taught school and studied law, and he began practicing law, and he became the go-to attorney for the Cherokee Indian tribe, represented some of the leaders of the Cherokees in some very, very important, historically significant trials. We're not sure when, but at some point he's converted to New Testament Christianity, maybe while he was still in Little Rock, or maybe soon after he came to Fayetteville. Soon after he came to Fayetteville, he married a local girl by the name of Sarah Connor. Hers was a very respected Washington County family. In 1836, he held a public debate with a regular Baptist preacher, regular Baptist Calvinistic, intense Calvinistic, by the name of Stephen Strickland from Baptist Ford. As a result of that debate, Stephen Strickland was converted, and several members of his congregation were as well. And so they organized a church in West Fork, 40 to 50 people gathering under an elm tree along the river in West Fork. The next year, they built a log meeting house. Alfred Arrington and Stephen Strickland, along with a man named, were the first elders. Now, after that, Alfred Arrington leaves for Texas, and we don't hear any more about him. But he's had an impact on this area and on the restoration movement in northwest Arkansas. In the year 1839, two families arrived in Fayetteville who will become very important to the history of this town, hugely important to the history of this town, and to the Lord's Church in Fayetteville. Dr. Thomas Jefferson Pollard, one of them, was born in Kentucky, educated at Transylvania University. He was a member of a family that had connections to the restoration movement and had close personal ties to the great restoration preacher John T. Johnson. I'll talk about him a little bit more. His wife, Mary Willis Sturman, was the daughter of a hero of the American Revolution, the Revolutionary War. And the family that moved here was her brother and his wife, J.H. Stearman, either at the same time or within a few weeks after the Pollards moved here. The Sturmans came here as well, and J.H. Sturman becomes Fayetteville's leading merchant. In the history of Fayetteville, he played an important part. He served in the early days as a mayor. He was the registrar of deeds. He not only was the leading merchant, but he also was involved in a lot of other enterprises as well. For several years, these two families attended worship with that group in West Fork, which, in horse and buggy days would have been a fairly a good trip for them every Lord's Day. In these, however, the Pollards and the Sturmans, along with Jonas and Matilda Tebbets, who were also attending church there, and Sarah Arrington. When her husband left for Texas, she didn't go with him. And as far as I've been able to find, they never lived together again. He went to Texas, later became a judge in Chicago, and as far as I know, they never lived as husband and wife again after that. Sarah Connor Arrington was a very faithful member of the church and very active in its affairs. These people start meeting in the courthouse, which was at the center of the square where the old post office is now. And J.H. Sturman, whose father was a gospel preacher and had brothers who were preachers who became very prominent preachers down in Texas, J.H. Sturman did the preaching for them. There's a picture I found of Dr. Thomas Jefferson Pollard. Here is his wife, Mary Pollard, a woman of character and intelligence. Robert Graham, who had such an impact on the church here, says that she was the most intelligent woman he ever met in his travels or studies or anything else. I've never been able to find a picture of J.H. Sturman, who was such an important citizen. I did find this picture of his wife, Catherine. And then here's a picture of Jonas Tebbets as he looked in those days. He married a woman by the name of Matilda, who was a cousin to Mary Pollard and a cousin to J.H. Sturman. They were brother and sister. And Jonas Tebbets met her here in Fayetteville. She was a student at the Fayetteville Female Seminary going to school. And he met her and married her. So these four, plus J.H. Sturman, plus Matilda Tebbets, plus Sarah Arrington, were the church. And they began in the courthouse, along with their children. So altogether, the group was 10 to 15. Important year for the history of the church was 1848, when John T. Johnson, who I believe was the greatest evangelist of the Restoration movement, came to Fayetteville from Van Buren via the overland stage. He had come by riverboat to Little Rock, had preached very successfully in Little Rock, and then came on to Northwest Arkansas. And it's now clear to me that the thing that brought him to Northwest Arkansas is the long-standing ties he had with the Pollards and the Sturmans. These were people he knew well from his part of Kentucky. He and Dr. Pollard had served together in the War of 1812, and so it was their influence which brought John T. Johnson to Fayetteville. I believe that John T. Johnson traveled more miles and converted more people to Christ than any other preacher of the American Restoration. One of his contemporaries, well-known preacher in his own right, estimated that during the time of his active preaching, John T. Johnson averaged making 10 converts a day, stretched over a period of about 25 years. He was the brother of Richard M. Johnson, very prominent Kentucky family. His brother Richard was vice president of the United States under Martin Van Buren. He had another brother named Benjamin Johnson, who was the most important political figure in Arkansas. He was the first territorial judge of Arkansas, and that made him a political power. Up until the time of the Civil War, every United States senator from Arkansas was either a son or son-in-law of Judge Benjamin Parker. Judge Benjamin Parker was converted by his brother on this same trip when he was in Little Rock. And so he not only baptized his brother, but then he came to Fayetteville to engage in a protracted meeting. While he's there, he was joined by Robert Graham, young man who had just graduated from Alexander Campbell's Bethany College. Now then, he was touring what they called the Southwest in those days on behalf of Brother Campbell. He was trying to sell subscriptions to the Manila Harbinger. He was collecting on people who had subscribed and received it and hadn't paid. He's also trying to raise funds for an endowment for Bethany College. And so these two men worked together for about 10 days or so in this protracted meeting. John T. Johnson wrote a letter to Alexander Campbell, and it was published in the Manila Harbinger, and it talked about this work here in Fayetteville. The letter dated March 7th, 1848. Beloved brother Campbell, I visited Fayetteville, 52 miles north of Van Buren, and labored 12 days with great success. We had 35 editions and organized a church 50 strong with elders and deacons. We have 4 able lawyers, a physician, and a distinguished preacher of the Cumberland Presbyterians in the congregation. When he says organized, he means that the church chose elders and deacons. I used to think that the church didn't exist in Fayetteville until this meeting. But as we've seen, there were a handful of people who were meeting together in the courthouse, but they were unorganized. That is, they had no elders or deacons. Following this meeting, the members of the church here in Fayetteville tried to persuade Robert Graham to move to Fayetteville to become their preacher. But Robert Graham had this commitment to Alexander Campbell, and he hadn't fulfilled it, and so he continued on his travels to Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, and he didn't get back home until August of 1848, which means he had been traveling for at least 8 months and maybe a year. He was visited there by J.H. Sturman, the merchant, who had gone to Pittsburgh to buy his goods, have them shipped to Arkansas. But since Robert Graham was living there, J.H. Sturman calls on him and urges him again to come as the minister for the Fayetteville church. Graham agreed, and they arrived in Fayetteville about Christmas time of 1848. Never found a picture of J.H. Sturman. I did find this picture of his house, which used to be on College Avenue in the days when you remember those beautiful homes and all of those maple trees used to line College Avenue. After Robert Graham arrived, the church started meeting in the Masonic Hall, which was located on the corner of Block and Rock Streets, so not so very far from here. That Masonic Hall had been built on land donated by our Governor Archibald Yell, and Archibald Yell himself did a lot of the work building this building. There was a member of the church named John Onsalt, and Robert Graham, who was a carpenter by trade, and Onsalt built pews for the courthouse, for the Masonic Hall, Robert Graham had been promised a salary of $400 a year, and he had a growing family. He had 8 children by the time he left here, or had 8 children born by the time he left here. And so he found the salary inadequate, and so he began to teach school on the side, a very famous institution at Mount Comfort called the Ozark Institute, established by Robert Mecklin. He worked there for a year. The next year, he established his own school on Dixon Street. In the 12 years that Robert Graham lived here in Fayetteville, I think that he probably had a greater impact on this city than any other person in the history of Fayetteville. He built a strong, thriving congregation of the Lord's church, and then he designed and helped to construct a substantial meeting house on the southwest corner of the square. That's a picture of the old Washington Hotel. Some of you can remember it. The building of the church was located on that very same corner. It was destroyed, of course, during the Civil War. Robert Graham designed it, drew the plans, and he's the one who built it. And by all accounts, it was the finest church building in the city of Fayetteville. He also established Arkansas College, a Christian college under the auspices of the church in 1850. As a master carpenter, he built all of the college buildings, as well as identical homes for himself and for Jonas Tebbets, who we've already met. Jonas Tebbets was a lawyer, but now then he becomes the secretary treasurer of Arkansas College. In this picture, you see the campus of Arkansas College. The college buildings are on the right, and there are a couple of little houses just on the fringe. Can you see those? I put an arrow on them. Graham built those houses. They were identical. One of those houses is still in existence. It's known today as the headquarters house. It's the house that Jonas M. Tebbets lived in. The other house, according to Graham, was identical to it. It was burned along with the college buildings during the Civil War. But the Tebbets house, or the headquarters house, endures till today. Arkansas College became the first chartered college in Arkansas in 1852. It was located on College Avenue, and that's the reason it's called College Avenue. College Avenue has nothing to do with the University of Arkansas. It was named for Arkansas College, which existed there. This became the first college in Arkansas to grant degrees. Many of the members of the board of directors were members of the Fayetteville Church. That would include T.J. Pollard, Jonas Tebbets, J.H. Sturman, and others. It was very much an enterprise from the Fayetteville Church. In 1860, one of the great preachers of the Restoration movement, Jacob Creeth Jr., traveled to Fayetteville. He was living at the time in Missouri. He preached for the church and gave some lectures at Arkansas College, and then he wrote an account of his visit to Fayetteville for the Millennial Harbinger. Among other things, he said, "I will say, having traversed the entire state in the 2 last years, that Fayetteville is the most moral and orderly town I have seen in the state. There is a different moral atmosphere here from any other place I visited." Oh, that were still true today. Robert Graham was married to Mariah Graham, and a very interesting archaeological find turned up in the 1960s on East Dixon Street, close to where the house was. They found this gravestone, and it's a marker for 4 children of Robert and Mariah Graham. The names are Caradora, Annie, Robert, and Harry. Children who died in the 12 years that they were here in Fayetteville. Not been able to find any more information, whether they died in some contagion or epidemic, or whether they died at childbirth. The gravestone was found at a place where old-timers in Fayetteville remember there used to be a small cemetery located on Dixon Street. Robert Graham was pro-Union. During the Civil War, he left Fayetteville. The church building on the square was burned. Arkansas College was burned. Following the burning of their house of worship, the congregation returned to the Masonic Hall and met in the Masonic Hall for several years. A new building was constructed after the Civil War. They started on it in 1869, didn't finish it until 1872. Interestingly, they didn't build it back on the location they owned on the square, but they built it on the grounds of Arkansas College. There's a picture of the building as it looked, as it existed in those days. Among the ministers in the late 1870s and 1880s were J.M. Shepard, J.F. Floyd, and Gay Waters. These men are interesting and important because they were very solid preachers of the gospel who stood resolutely against instrumental music and the missionary society, which were the 2 issues that were troubling the church. In fact, J.F. Floyd, while he was here in Fayetteville preaching for the church, started a gospel paper called The Faithful Witness. I came across a copy of that, couldn't find it, and I was going to bring it to show it to you today. But The Faithful Witness was a very conservative paper representing the views of those who opposed the instrument and who opposed the Missionary Society. That's in the 1880s. Robert Graham came back to Fayetteville in 1882. They had a very successful gospel meeting or revival. It says in a shed north of town. I have no idea where it was. Apparently it was some kind of an open air meeting. The church building was destroyed by fire in 1912, and then it was rebuilt, and it's the present building of the First Christian Church in Fayetteville on College Avenue now. Go back with me to these key people who brought New Testament Christianity to Fayetteville. In the 1880s, their influence is waning. Mary Pollard died, this intelligent, influential woman. Because of that, her husband, Thomas Jefferson Pollard, who was one of the elders of the congregation, who opposed instrumental music, who was being constantly beset and harangued by a handful of members who wanted instrumental music, decided to resign. And so he resigned as an elder. Catherine Sturman, whose husband was J.H. Sturman, I have no picture of, but he also had died in the 1870s. And Jonas Tebbets and his wife had moved to Kentucky after the Civil War. And so basically what you have is another generation becoming the influential members. One of the leaders was Erasmus Sturman, who was the son of J.H. and Catherine Sturman. He had been a Confederate cavalry officer during the Civil War. He became the mayor of Fayetteville, was extremely important. This is his sister, Rebecca Sturman. She is the first woman to graduate from college, to receive a college degree in the state of Arkansas. She graduated from Arkansas College, the first woman to do so. She was widowed. She and her husband took over the store her father ran on the square. In those days, the offices were upstairs, and they had the goods for sale downstairs. One of the things they sold was firearms. And one day somebody came in, and so they were looking at a gun, and somehow it was loaded, and the gun went off, and the bullet passed through the floor and struck her husband and killed him. And so then she married this man, B.R. Davidson, who was the richest man in Fayetteville, had the most sensational house in Fayetteville. He was the attorney for the Frisco Railroad, the general counsel for the whole Frisco Railroad line. These people are the socially elite of Fayetteville. The church has swelled in membership, and many of the people are those who are the well-to-do, the most socially known, and there is this growing desire to have a king like the nations around us, to participate in the same practices which they saw in the denominations. Now, another man that we need to meet that I don't have a picture of, but he is vitally important to our story, and that is Dr. Redding Putman and his wife Elizabeth. He was actually Redding Putman II. His father was Redding Putman I. He was, his family moved to Arkansas when he was a small child. His father had always wanted to be a doctor, but had been unable to be one, and so his son developed an interest in medical questions, and he would get every book he could find on the subject and read them. In 1855, Redding Putman married Elizabeth Reed, whose family had moved here from Georgia, and they lived on a farm a few miles south of Fayetteville. She was just 16 years old when they married. Her parents were Robert Reed and Elizabeth Fagala, whose father was another veteran of the Revolutionary War. In the 1860 census, Redding Putman and his wife Elizabeth are listed as living in their own or on their own farm, and they have 3 young children, Anne, Robert, and Mary. That next year, they moved from the farm south of Fayetteville to Fayetteville itself. Redding became an apprentice, I guess you would say, to Dr. Thomas Jefferson Pollard. Became his student. He learned to practice medicine from Dr. Pollard, who was one of the outstanding physicians of his day. Whether it was Dr. Pollard's influence, I don't know, but Redding, Putman, and his wife Elizabeth became members of the church. And eventually, he not only became Dr. Pollard's partner in his medical practice, but they were fellow elders in the church here in Fayetteville. Redding's father, Redding Sr., moved to Fayetteville, moved in with his family after his house was burned by Confederate raiders during the Civil War, and he died in September of 1865. The Putmans raised 4 children. The eldest 2, Anna and Robert, were 1/4 of the first class of the University of Arkansas. When the University of Arkansas opened in 1871, there were 8 students, and 2 of them were the children of Dr. Redding Putman. Another interesting thing is that when the state of Arkansas was looking for a location for its land-grant university, various communities who had an interest made bids to gain the university. It seems to pretty much have been between Pulaski County, Little Rock, and Northwest Arkansas. And in order to make the Fayetteville bid more attractive, Dr. and Mrs. Putman went around to all the people of Fayetteville and signed up people who would be willing to house students in their home. So that there were no dormitories originally when the college started, so there'd be a place for them to live. I found Elizabeth Putman's obituary in the newspaper, and it said that during her life, she and Redding Putman had literally made a home in Fayetteville for hundreds of university students. In the 1880 census, which I also found, 20 students are recorded as living in their home. And so Dr. Putman was one of the leading medical practitioners in the state eventually, first president of the Fayetteville Medical Association. They were instrumental in the life of the church and also in the university. Both Dr. Putman and Dr. Pollard, in fact, almost all the people we've talked about today, are buried down in Evergreen Cemetery, just a little ways down the hill there. You can see Dr. Putman's stone, born 1830, died 1914. The Fayetteville Church continued to grow. In the 10 years between 1885 and 1894, there were 497 additions to the congregation. In 1885, a new preacher arrives in Fayetteville. His name is Nathaniel Madison Ragland, usually went by his initials, N.M. Ragland. There's his picture. He'd been preaching in Carthage, Missouri. He was a Missourian by birth. And he had first been approached informally by some of the members of the Fayetteville Church who wanted to introduce instrumental music into the congregation. They had learned about him and his work, knew that he had had connections to congregations in St. Louis, which were the first churches west of the Mississippi to use instrumental music, First Churches of Christ west of the Mississippi. Almost immediately, when he became the preacher, N.M. Ragland began to advocate for instrumental music. To begin with, he pushed to have a small piano set up in the Sunday school classes so that the young people could learn new songs and also to increase their interest. And then some of the people began to urge that they bring the piano or get an organ and bring it into the worship of the church. There was a majority opposed. It was a slim majority, but there were more people against this than for it. But Thomas Jefferson Pollard has resigned as an elder. There's a new generation, and basically it was decided by the minority, although it was a sizable minority, that instrumental music would be used. Dr. Pollard, as I say, had already resigned as an elder. He was in poor health. His wife had passed away. He made an announcement that he was not reconciled to the use of instrumental music, but that he would no longer speak out against it publicly. When the instrument was introduced in the Sunday school, Dr. Redding Putman and some other members began to hold what they called cottage prayer meetings, and they conducted a mission Sunday school for children, apparently mostly of poor families, down on Government Avenue. They continued to attend worship services at the main church, or at the what is now the First Christian Church, until the instrument was brought into the assembly. And so in the spring of 1886, those opposing the piano, and I think it was a sizable group, although not nearly all who were opposed, many of those who had been vocally opposed stayed during this period when they introduced instrumental music. Dr. Putman and maybe as many as 70 or 80 people felt they had no alternative but to withdraw from the church, and they began to meet in private homes, and then eventually they constructed a building on Government Avenue. Here's a picture of Fayetteville in 1890. This is the period that we're talking about. The population was 2,942, and this is South Fayetteville. Way up there in the upper right-hand corner, can you see a building that has a little tower and it has a little cupola on it, right against the edge? That's the courthouse, which sat in the middle of the square, so you can kind of get oriented. Down somewhere in the lower left-hand quarter gets us close to Government Avenue, where the church was established. The first meeting place of the church was this building, built in 1888. At 521 Government Avenue. It was also used as a school during the week. The lots for the building were donated by S.H. Blackmore. The building continued to serve the church until 1924. The first elders recorded of this congregation were Redding Putman, A.W. Broyles, and A.W. Arnold. In the beginning, the church wasn't able to support a full-time minister. And so basically preachers came by appointment to preach. In time, preachers began to come for 1 or 2 days a month, and the church began to prosper. In 1924, they built this building out on the same location. I'm not sure, and I'm sure somebody knows, whether they tore the old building down or they also discussed the possibility of selling it and having it moved away. And I'm not sure which happened, but this building was built, was enlarged in 1928, 1931, 1936. By the end, it had an auditorium that seated 500 people, and there were 11 classrooms. The first preacher who came to live in Fayetteville was a Johnny Martin. I've been able to trace nothing about him at all. Another early preacher who came sporadically, probably once a month at times, was a Brother Morgan and a Brother Samuel Roscoe Beeman. Now, this is Brother Beeman and his wife. Brother Beeman lived in Seligman, Missouri. He would come down on the train to preach. Brother Guy Couch told me about Brother Beeman and his preaching here. It's interesting, and one of the elders of the church here was Guy's brother, Sam Couch. Sam Couch is named for this man. Sam's name was Samuel Roscoe Couch, named for Brother Beeman. And Guy Couch told me an interesting thing as well. The first automobile he ever saw was one that Brother Beeman drove down after years of coming on the train. He bought a car, and Guy said it was the first car I ever saw and the first car I ever rode in. Another early preacher, George B. Curtis, I'm not sure when he was here, but I do have a letter that he wrote at a time when he speaks of himself as the preacher at Fayetteville, but the letter's not dated. Another early preacher was L.E. Pryor, or Lonnie Pryor. Lonnie Pryor was a longtime teacher at Harding College. He was the father of Dr. Joseph Pryor, who was for many, many years the academic dean of Harding. And I suspect that L.E. Pryor worked with the church some here while he himself was doing study at the university. Another early preacher was W.B. Ragsdale, shown here with his wife, William Baxter Ragsdale. He preached during the year 1922 while he was attending the very famous County Line Bible School. He'd been converted by his wife and had been baptized by John T. Hines. John T. Hines, one of the most highly respected, well-known brethren of the era, had a connection to the church for lasting on and off for 30 years, I think. In 1897, he was selected to conduct a gospel meeting, and then for the rest of that year and the 2 years that followed, he continued to preach at least 1 or 2 Sundays a month. Brother Hines lived in Rogers, and as far as I know, he never was a resident in Fayetteville. He never moved to Fayetteville, but he also would come down on the train to preach. There's a notation that in 1899, the church paid him $5 a month to preach on the Saturday night before the first Sunday, and also to preach on the Sunday and the Sunday night. $5 for preaching 3 times. In 1919, he was supported for the first 6 months of that year to preach. Here's a picture of him when he's a little older. He was a highly respected preacher, teacher, author. He was the front page editor for a long time of the Firm Foundation, and for many years he wrote the annual lesson commentary for the Gospel Advocate Company. The last regular preaching he did at Government Avenue seems to have been in 1930. In the Gospel Advocate set of commentaries, which every preacher has to have in their library, Brother Hines wrote the volume on the book of Revelation. He became the editor of the Gospel Advocate in 1934 until his death in 1938. It's interesting, most of that time he's still living in Rogers. He would go and spend periods in Nashville. He lived in a boarding house there. And then he would go back and forth. And in 1938, he suffered a stroke while he was eating supper one night. They brought him back to Fort Smith, to the hospital. They thought he was making a full recovery. But then he suffered another very serious stroke. They transported him to Oklahoma City, where he died. And he also is buried down there in Evergreen Cemetery, like so many of the other early leaders of the church. It's a picture I don't know anything else about except it's a ladies' Bible class from the 13th of June, 1925. C.C. Houston, Charles C. Houston, was born in Kansas, 1876. He preached in Florida, Kentucky, Kansas, Tennessee, Arkansas, and California. He studied at Freed-Hardeman College, and for a while he taught in the Wichita Bible School. In 1926, he was hired to preach, and this is really the beginning of the church's outreach to University of Arkansas students. Brother Houston got a list from the authorities of all the students who indicated Church of Christ as their preference, and all the students who had no religious preference. And he sent a personal letter to every one of them, inviting them to come to the services of a gospel meeting. They arranged that members of the church who had automobiles would pick them up at the south entrance of Old Main, would drive them to church, and then back home. In 1927, The church was struggling financially, had a hard time meeting expenses and paying for the new building. Interestingly, though, in 1927, they secured a lot, rented, I think, on the corner of Center and Church Streets. See, I told you they were on Center Street quite a while before this building was built. This is 20 years before that. They held an open-air tent meeting, just one block in that direction, to the corner of Church and Center Street. The church had voted to retain C.C. Houston for 1927 and again for 1928. But in August of 1928, they had to let him go because they didn't have money to pay him. It's interesting that in those early days, most of the preachers stayed for a year or two at most. So in April of 1930, John T. Hines is once again engaged to preach once a month until the end of the year. Another well-known evangelist who I couldn't find a photo of, Leo P. Mansfield, preached for the church from December of 1930 until December of 1931. After which, the very celebrated preacher Eli Monroe Borden, E.M. Borden, who born in Texas, his father was a lawyer who gave up the practice of the law to become a preacher. His own father had been a preacher. The Bordens produced 5 generations of preacher. E.M. Borden's father and grandfather, and then his son and grandson all became gospel preachers. He moved to Arkansas in 1902, started a paper called the Christian Pilot. E.M. Borden was one of the most famous debaters, probably the most famous debater in Churches of Christ after Alexander Campbell. He conducted a large number of debates. Many of those books are still in print of his debates on various subjects. In 1932, he was hired at $100 a month to preach. He was renewed for 1933, but he offered his resignation as of July the 1st, 1934. An interesting thing I discovered was that the young members of the church came to the elders with a petition asking that Brother Borden stay longer. I don't know whether he was unwilling or the elders were unwilling. I do know that he preached his farewell sermon the following Sunday. The next preacher, 1934, was Fred McClung. He was just 25 years old when he came. He was a man of considerable energy and ability. He was a man who had lots of ideas and worked hard on them. He had an uncle by the name of Claude McClung. During the time that Fred McClung was here, and then Claude McClung through him had contacts, the two of them held many gospel meetings in Washington County and Madison County. They held meetings where there were 70 or 80 baptisms. When I was a young preacher just starting out, it used to seem to me that when I met people, when I would talk to them about how they became a Christian, they would say either I was baptized by Fred McClung or I was baptized by Claude McClung. I think half the Baldwin congregation were baptized by one or the other of them. There's his Uncle Claude. The elders in 1933 were W.O. Lucas, C.E. Johnson, W.S. Fritz, and Sam Couch. O.L. Daly and Walter Miller became elders in 1936. Another thing that apparently dates to this period, a work that the Center Street Church was involved in for a long time, was a radio program. That's Fred McClung at the very back on the left. And they had live singing for that radio program. And so the people there are some who went to the radio station to sing. This was in the 1930s. In the 50s, the cost of radio programs as follows. They had a daily 15-minute program. It cost $5.50 a time. Sunday morning, they had a 30-minute program, which was $11. And Sunday night, they had a 1-hour program, which was $19.80. And the preacher from the Government Avenue congregation, as it was then, did the preaching. Other congregations in the area contributed to that effort. Another thing that I used to have and I've lost, my father was the treasurer for the funds for the radio program. He actually did some of the preaching on the radio program when they were between preachers. But I used to have a little receipt book of donations, many of them from individuals, some of them from churches, that were contributed for the purpose of radio preaching. This must have been one of the first churches to begin using the medium of radio. In 1936, Harbert D. Hooker came. He was a graduate of Abilene Christian College. He was just 33 years old when he came. He had a salary of $125 a month. And in 1940, 1941, he transitioned to a work of preaching, holding tent meetings as an evangelism throughout Northwest Arkansas. And at that time, the church in Springdale became the overseeing congregation of his work, although other congregations, including the Government Avenue Church, contributed financially to the work. There's a picture. He had this tent that he would carry around, and he had that panel van. My dad told me that he had 2 big car batteries in there, and so he had a light system that he would set up in the tent. In the preaching that he did, 19 congregations were established in Northwest Arkansas. Not all of those congregations still exist. Many of them do. One of them is the Church at Winslow, where I'm privileged to preach. Some of the churches merged and some of them have fallen away, but 19 churches were established. The preacher who came in 1940 was Taylor Davis. They decided to keep him for another year and then a third year. He was born in Lawrence County of Arkansas in 1887, preached for many years in Oklahoma, Texas, Tennessee, many places in Arkansas. He was highly respected, one of the leading preachers of the Brotherhood. I found a quotation from one of his contemporaries who said that his quiet manner, pleasant disposition, and plain sound teaching blessed the lives of multitudes of people. Next preacher was Glenn Parks. I don't know anything about him. I couldn't find any information or pictures of him. And then Alan Harper, who came in 1943, preached for the congregation until 1945. Alan Harper was a graduate of Abilene Christian, and he was just 25 years old when he came to work with the church on Government Avenue. And then the last preacher on Government Avenue was Joe Spalding, who began work with the church in 1947 when he was 30 years of age. He continued through the summer of 1949. He was a graduate of Harding College, and while he was here in Fayetteville, he was working on his master's degree in history. He received the first master's degree bestowed by the history department of the University of Arkansas. And then he left in the summer of 1949, moved to Oklahoma, and he got his PhD at the University of Oklahoma and spent most of his life preaching, but also teaching in Christian colleges. Here's a picture of a vacation Bible school that was held in 1948, the year in which this building was being built on Government Avenue. I'm going to show you half of it at a time so you can sort of get a look at the people. A few people I know because they're related to me. There's my sister, Mary Hughes. There's my brother, George Lawson. Here's my cousin, Harry Mills. There's Thomas William Dockery. And then up at the back, you see Brother Spalding and their sister Spalding. Now go to the other side of it. On the right hand, right here in the front row, is Randall Castleman. And next to him, that's Leo Ryan. And then way up there on the back is my aunt, Opal Mills. It's a huge Vacation Bible School, and the church here has a tradition of taking Vacation Bible School pictures, and they have them going back for many, many years. Well, by 1942, it had become apparent that the church needed a new meeting place. So in October of 42, Sam Couch, O.L. Daly, Lester Fritz, and Walter Miller were chosen as trustees to negotiate and arrange for the sale of a lot. Church members voted on whether or not to build a new building. In the downtown area, the vote was 174 yes, 28 no, and 2 undecided. The land was purchased on the corner of Center and Locust Streets. Work didn't actually begin until 1948. The bids were turned in May, and the winning bid for the construction of this building was $94,400. The month of June, construction began. This is fascinating to me. Some of the materials that were used in building this building: 2 freight cars loads plus 59 tons plus 8 yards of sand, 1,295 bags of cement, 14,000 bags of lime. I don't understand how they could use that much lime. 264 yards of gravel, 3 freight cars plus 5,000 more bricks, 16 arch bricks from the University of Arkansas, structural steel from Fort Smith. They hauled stone twice from the Carthage Marble Company. These light fixtures, $1,800. When I was a small boy, I was always fascinated by the light fixtures in here and the beams, and I would sit here in the pews, and at least I always looked up. But I've spent a lot of hours staring at those lights and the beams. They fascinated me. And the Century Arc Glass produced the 3 windows at a cost of $565. There's a postcard of the building and the way it looked in those days. First service was conducted here September the 11th, 1949. First preacher to preach in the new building was Charles Caldwell Jr. He came in the middle of 1949. He was 30 years old. He remained here until 1951. He had been a student at Freed-Hardeman College. He was the son of a gospel preacher. He was junior, and his father, Charles Caldwell Sr., came here and held a gospel meeting for the church. He was succeeded by Fred McClung in his second stint as preacher for the church here, this time in the Center Street building, and this time Brother McClung stayed until August of 1953. During the time he was here, they held an encampment on Mount Sequoia in 1953, just so you might be, so you can pick out maybe some people. There's half of it. The speaker was Brother Arian Hogan, the very well-known African-American evangelist from Los Angeles. He's standing there on the left wearing the suit and tie. Brother E.R. Harper did some of the preaching for this. Here's the right side of the crowd. In 1953, the house that was next door was purchased for $13,000 as a residence for the preacher. And in 1954, Joe Lawrence Banks, who was an alumnus of Abilene Christian University, came to work with the Center Street Church. He was 33 years old when he first came. When the North Street Church was planted in 1958, he became the first minister for the North Street Church. He returned to Fayetteville in 1964, stayed through 1973 working with the church. He spent 1 year during that time as a missionary supported by the church in Ghana. Here's a picture of him in his second appearance. He looks a little older, but much as we would have remembered him, I think. While he was here, they had another encampment on Mount Sequoia, this one in 1956. And there you can take a look at half the crowd, and here's the other half. There were some other encampments at other places, which I don't have photographs of. During the 1950s, the congregation grew dramatically. They established a student work at the University of Arkansas, and then in 1958, they started the North Street Church of Christ. Here, elders about 1964, Arthur Castleman, O.L. Daly, Ralph Terry, and Glenn Oxford. Here's a picture of students in connection with the students' work, and Brother Banks, and R.B. Barton, and his wife Jane in the picture. Here's the property they bought on Storer Avenue for the Student Center work. The first director hired was Jim Murray, who worked with the students from mid-1964 through May of 1967. Here's an article from the Northwest Arkansas Times in 1964, speaking of the open house they set. Others who worked over the years with the work were Jim and Linda Arnett and R.B. and Jane Barton, not Barnett, but Barton. Not sure how I made that mistake. Here's another clipping I found from 1967. They were offering special classes to students. And Dub Chisholm, who was the North Street preacher, and Joe Banks, who was the Center Street preacher, and my brother Tom, who was preaching then at Baldwin, were teaching 3 different subjects at the University Center. Picture of the groundbreaking for the North Street building, October 1957. First service in the North Street building, June 20th, 1958, and Joe Banks becomes their first minister. He is replaced at Center Street by Floyd Irvin Stanley, who came in 1958, stayed till 1962. Brother Stanley was a prolific debater. He had more than 50 debates. And while he was here in Fayetteville, he and Joe Banks teamed up and had a debate with representatives of the non-Sunday school belief. F.I. Stanley was replaced by Jim Caldwell, who became the preacher in 1962. Jim Caldwell was just 26 years old when he came as the preacher here at Center Street, and he stayed till January of 64. And then, as we've already noted, Joe Banks returned to work with the Center Street Church in 64. And my brother Tom, Thomas William Dockery Sr., was hired as a second man in 1968 as an associate minister. He was to concentrate on the University Student Center, the church educational program, and also the missions program of the church. Later, he served for a while as the pulpit minister, and his connection with the church continued until May of 1978. 1977, the new educational wing was completed. The auditorium was remodeled in 1989. An elevator was installed in 1997. Expansion of the fellowship hall, instruction of a new class space, completed in 2005. The church here was very much involved in establishing and supporting the work of the Combe Street Church of Christ in 1961. They purchased the property on Combe Street in 1966 for $21,000. Work began on the original building there in 1975. Brother Riley West came to preach for the congregation in 1963 and continued to preach until 1980. Brother West was a grand man and a friend of mine who I thought was a prince and a gem of a person. Brother Albert Gardner was secured to go to Ghana. Joe Banks had spent a year in Ghana. My brother Tom spent 2 years. While Tom was there, after Joe left, Albert Gardner came here from October 73 to May 74, and then went to Ghana. The Center Street Church has had a gigantic impact on the work in Ghana and the success of the church there. Supported a number of men, and then began to support Dan and Brenda McVeigh, and that was a relationship that continued for many years. Through the work in Ghana, they became aware of Isaac Day, who was a Liberian, had gone as a refugee from Liberia to Ghana, where he was converted, obeyed the gospel, attended preacher school. And now then, since 1996, the church has been supporting Isaac Day in Gambia, Sierra Leone, and Liberia. Isaac Day is the man with the most audacious faith I have ever met. He is a man who does wonders, who is able to get things going, get things started. Obstacles just melt before him. I am very impressed with the great work that Isaac Day has done and is doing. Larry Mitchell came to preach 1978, 1988. Jack Harriman from 1988 to 2001. And Jack English from 2002 till now. Rob became a second man in 1991. Rob will be transitioning to become the new director of Gospel Tracts International in October. We'll still have some connections to the church here. As a youth minister, Jake Greer came in 2002, left maybe 2005. I wanted to say this. I think one of the most remarkable things about the Center Street Church is the way it has grown men for service. A number of preachers. I was going to make a list of all the preachers that come from this congregation, and I gave it up because I don't think I could. I don't think I know them all. Here are two produced by this congregation, Darren and Randall. While Randall was attending church here, he preached for many area churches as well. He worked with the young people, preached many years now at Bella Vista. Darren's been preaching for a long time at Black Oak. Darren's been working with the young people of the church here. I think one of the things that's just a reflection of the strength of this congregation are the young men who have grown to maturity and service and have had an impact in other places they have gone. Somehow I lost my place. There's where I wanted to go. This is my last slide. The man at the desk is G.H.P. Showalter, who was for many years the editor of the Firm Foundation in Austin, Texas, from 1908 to 1954. He produced a book entitled Travel Talks in 1954, and that's interesting to me because in that book he devotes a chapter to the church in Fayetteville. It was on Government Avenue then. But he says some things that I think make a very fitting conclusion to our discussion this morning. The primary purpose of my ramblings over in Arkansas, he says, was to be present at a meeting, a preacher's meeting over at Fayetteville. I came, I saw, I rejoiced. I was there 3 nights and 2 days. Discussions forenoon and afternoon and preaching at night, beginning at 9 a.m. and closing at 9:30 p.m. There was an intermission at high noon and another late in the evening, at which time, according to a well-arranged plan, the sisters of the church at Fayetteville served regular meals to all the visitors. The arrangement was carried out in a most excellent way and in line with the far-famed hospitality of that sturdy stock of humankind that cares for one of God's beauty spots on earth, the Ozarks. Fayetteville has one of the strongest congregations of faithful disciples anywhere. The elders are W.D. Lucas, Charles Johnson, Sam Couch, W.L. Fritz. Deacons are William Armstrong, O.L. Daly, Walter Miller, Floyd Broyles, and George Puderbaugh. Brother E.M. Borden is at this writing the efficient minister for the congregation. The meetings were well attended by other congregations in Reach, Rogers, Springdale, Fort Smith, and others. Brother John T. Hines of Rogers was in frequent attendance and made several good talks. It was a great pleasure to meet him again with his excellent wife. In my judgment, there is no better writer in our brotherhood than he. Then he goes on to say, too much cannot be said in praise of the brethren and sisters of this Fayetteville church. for their fine spirit and cooperation. The elders, deacons, and their wives and faithful children should particularly be mentioned. I'm sure that the names of these great, humble, peace-loving men of God who make up the elders and deacons are seldom heard outside of their own town. But they will shine forth in the brightness of heaven's glory. God will reward them for their works of faith and labor of love and patience of hope in the Lord. They patiently carry on the Lord's work, often with little thanks or expressed appreciation from those who benefit most from the service. They labor with their hands to make a living for themselves and those dependent on them, while weary days and anxious nights are often spent worrying over the difficulties and troubles that mar the fair name and threaten the peace and influence of the church of our Lord, over whom the Holy Spirit has made them overseers. I love the earnest, humble, faithful men and women who make up the rank and file members of the church, and through whose well-ordered lives and good influence the excellencies of Christ are shed abroad, and have been shed abroad from this location now for 70 years. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you very much, Bobby. We owe him a great deal of gratitude for sharing with us a heritage that is so rich and so important to the history and to the future of this church and of the churches throughout Northwest Arkansas. We thank you very, very much. He's put in obviously hundreds of hours in researching and accumulating this material, and I know all of us appreciate that very much. You may have other questions you may want to ask Bobby, and I'm sure he'll be available to answer any of those or attempt to. And we appreciate your presence here today. And our schedule calls for us to reassemble tonight at 6 o'clock for a cookout and time of fellowship and praise together. So we look forward to having you come at that time. If you're so inclined to do so, we hope that you will. And thank you very much for being here today. Continue to look at the displays, the fellowship, and whatever. And find a motorcycle if you can, right around town. And thank you very much. Dismissed.
Siri, turn on my flashlight.